There is a steak sitting in the meat case right now that most people walk past without a second look. It is not the thickest one. It does not have the prettiest marbling. The label does not say prime Wagyu or dry aged. And depending on where you shop, you can probably take one home for around $9. Put that same piece of beef on a restaurant menu, surround it with the right technique, and nobody at the table is going to ask what it cost the butcher. That is the part most shoppers never learn. The difference between an expensive steak and an inexpensive steak is not always the meat itself. Sometimes it is what happens before the meat ever reaches the plate. I have watched people spend twice as much on beef because they thought the higher price guaranteed tenderness. Then I have watched a good cook take an ordinary cut, handle it correctly, and produce a steak that makes the expensive one look like a waste of money. And there is one mistake that makes this whole comparison unfair before the pan even gets hot. People judge the steak before they understand the cut. That is like judging a truck by the paint before opening the hood. A butcher looks at beef differently. We look for grain. We look for connective tissue. We look at thickness. We look at where the muscle came from and how hard that muscle worked on the animal. Those things tell you what the steak needs. A tender, heavily marbled ribeye needs very little help. A lean working muscle needs a completely different approach. So when somebody tells you that the only way to get a great steak is to buy the most expensive one in the case, I would disagree. Not because expensive beef is bad, it is excellent, but because expensive beef is doing some of the work for you. Cheap beef makes you do the work. And once you understand that, the price difference starts to look very different. The first thing I would do with that inexpensive steak happens before seasoning. I would look at the thickness. If it is thin, I would not treat it like a steakhouse ribeye. That is where people get themselves into trouble. A thin piece of beef does not give you enough time to build a crust while keeping the center where you want it. If I have the choice, I want something close to 1.5 inches thick. Thickness gives you control. It gives the outside time to brown before the inside is pushed too far. And if the steak is uneven, I would trim the thin tail rather than pretending the whole piece will cook evenly. That little bit of trimming is one of the first things people pay for at a restaurant without realizing it. The kitchen has already made the steak easier to cook. You can do the same thing at home. Now dry the surface. Not mostly dry. Dry. Paper towels are not glamorous, but they matter because water sitting on the surface has to evaporate before browning can really get moving, and evaporation steals heat. That means the pan spends its first moments drying the steak instead of building the crust you actually want. This is why a steak can sit in a screaming hot pan and somehow come out gray. The pan was not necessarily the problem, the surface was. There is another little trick I use when the steak is inexpensive and leaner than I would like. I give it some fat later. Not by drowning it in oil, by using beef fat. Ask the butcher counter for beef trim. You may be surprised how inexpensive it is. In many shops, those little pieces of fat and meat are simply leftovers from trimming larger cuts. Take them home. Put the fat into a small saucepan over low heat. Give it time. As the fat melts, the liquid becomes clear and the solid pieces separate. Strain it. Now you have beef fat that can be used for cooking. And this matters because fat does something seasoning cannot. It gives the steak richness. You cannot manufacture marbling inside a lean muscle after you buy it, but you can control the fat around it. That is a completely different thing. Now we get to seasoning. And this is where people make the steak harder than it needs to be. You do not need 12 spices. You need salt. For a steak around 1 pound, roughly 3/4 teaspoon of kosher salt is a reasonable starting point, depending on the salt itself and how heavily you like to season. Season both sides, then give it time. If you can season it several hours ahead, even better. The salt first draws moisture toward the surface. Given enough time, that moisture dissolves the salt and moves back into the meat. The important part is that you are no longer cooking a wet piece of beef with salt sitting on top. You are seasoning the meat. That is a big difference. If you only have 15 minutes, season it and cook it. If you have several hours, use them. But do not make the mistake of leaving a salted steak sitting uncovered for a day and assuming longer automatically means better. More time is not always more improvement. There is a point where you stop gaining much and start creating unnecessary drying. This is one of those butcher lessons that sounds boring until you taste the difference. Now comes the part that can turn a cheap steak into something people remember. Heat management. Most home cooks think the steak needs one temperature. It does not. It needs different temperatures at different moments. First, you want enough heat to create browning. Then you want control. Then you want rest. Think of the steak as 3 separate jobs. Build the crust. Bring the center to temperature. Let the juices settle. If you try to accomplish all 3 with one violent blast of heat, the outside wins and the center loses. For a thick steak, I like a 2-stage approach. Start with a heavy pan or grill. Get it properly hot. Place the steak down and leave it alone long enough to develop real contact. Do not keep lifting it every 10 seconds. Do not spin it because you are nervous. Let the surface brown. Then turn it. If the steak is thick, lower the heat or move it to a cooler zone and let the center come up gradually. That is how you get a dark exterior without building a thick gray band underneath it. And if you own a thermometer, use it. A thermometer does not make you less of a cook. It makes you more consistent. For a medium rare finish, you can pull a steak before it reaches its final serving temperature because the temperature will continue to rise while it rests. The exact rise depends on thickness and cooking method, so do not treat one number like a law of nature. Watch the temperature, learn your pan, learn your steak. That is how professionals become consistent. There is another technique that works especially well when the beef is lean: reverse searing. Instead of starting with the hottest pan, you gently bring the center of the steak upward first. An oven around 225 degrees Fahrenheit is a useful starting point. Put the steak on a rack so hot air can circulate around it. Let the center gradually reach roughly 95 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Then move it to an extremely hot pan. Now, the sear does not have to cook the entire steak. It only has to brown the outside. That is why the gray band becomes much smaller. And this is where a lot of expensive restaurant steaks get their advantage. Not because the cook possesses some secret ingredient, because the cook understands heat. The steak is not fighting the pan anymore. The cook is controlling the temperature gradient. There is one thing I would not do, though. I would not leave a thick steak sitting on the kitchen counter for 45 minutes because somebody told me that makes it reach room temperature. It barely does. A thick piece of beef is a poor conductor of heat. The center changes slowly. You can leave it out for a while and still have a cold center. Meanwhile, you have simply added unnecessary time at an unsafe temperature. If you want the center warmer before the sear, use controlled heat. That is what reverse searing actually accomplishes. Now let's talk about the cheapest trick in this entire process: cutting. This is where you can take a steak that was never designed to be tender and make it much easier to eat. Look at the muscle fibers. You will see lines running through the meat. That is the grain. Your knife should cross those lines, not follow them. If you cut with the grain, you are leaving long muscle fibers for your teeth to deal with. Cut across it and you shorten those fibers before the steak reaches your mouth. It is one of the simplest transformations you can make, and it costs nothing. I have seen people spend hours marinating a piece of beef, cook it carefully, rest it properly, and then ruin the eating experience with the final knife cut. The steak is not necessarily tough. They just serve the fibers in the longest possible form. And there is another reason this matters with inexpensive beef. Cheap cuts often come from muscles that worked harder. More work means more connective tissue and stronger muscle structure. You cannot always turn those muscles into a tenderloin, but you can change how the eater experiences them. Cutting across the grain is one of the most reliable ways to do that. Now, if you have a particularly tough piece, there is a second tool: fruit. Not because fruit is magical, because certain fruits contain enzymes that can break down proteins. Pineapple, papaya, kiwi, and Asian pear can all be used in different ways. But this is where people get impatient. They leave the meat in the marinade overnight because they think more time means more tenderness. That can go completely wrong. With enzyme-rich ingredients, too much exposure can damage the texture. Instead of tender, you can end up with meat that feels soft and almost pasty on the surface. So keep the treatment controlled. For a thinly sliced, tough beef preparation, a few hours can be enough, and the slicing still matters more than the marinade. If you have a piece of flank, skirt, sirloin, tip, or chuck, put it in the freezer for roughly 45 minutes. You are not trying to freeze it solid. You just want the surface and interior firm enough that your knife can make cleaner, thinner cuts. Then find the grain. Then cut across it. Now you have changed the job the meat has to perform. Instead of asking one thick piece of tough muscle to become tender through heat alone, you have mechanically shortened the fibers before cooking. That is butcher thinking. Do not ask the steak to become something it was never designed to be. Change the way you use it. And there is one more trick I would add before we move into the techniques that really start changing the character of inexpensive beef. Fat. But not just any fat, beef fat. If you save that rendered trim, warm a small amount in the pan before the steak goes in, then near the end, add another spoonful along with crushed garlic and a little herb if you want. Tilt the pan, baste. The hot fat runs over the brown surface and carries flavor with it. This does not create marbling. It does not turn chuck into ribeye. That distinction matters, but it can make a lean steak taste richer and more complete. That is the honest version of the trick. You are adding richness outside the muscle, and sometimes that is exactly what an inexpensive steak needs. Now we can get into the methods that most people would never think to use on a cheap piece of beef. One of them involves salt. Another uses a method that looks almost wrong the first time you see it. And one of them takes a cut that most shoppers would ignore and turns it into something much closer to the steakhouse experience than its price suggests. The important part is that none of these tricks require you to pretend the meat is something it isn't. You are simply matching the technique to the muscle, and that is where the real savings begin. Part 2. The most expensive mistake you can make with inexpensive beef is cooking it like expensive beef. That sounds backwards, but it is true. A beautifully marbled ribeye can survive a little carelessness. A lean working muscle cannot, so the cheaper the cut, the more important your technique becomes. One of my favorite examples is a salt block. People see one sitting on a grill or flat top and assume it is just a fancy way to season food. It is more interesting than that. A thick salt block stores heat and releases it gradually across its surface. That gives you a very different cooking surface from a thin pan. But there is a serious warning here. Do not heat a salt block like you would heat cast iron. A block can contain moisture inside the salt structure. Heat it too aggressively and that moisture can expand faster than it can escape. The block can crack, so start low, give it time, increase the heat gradually. A 45-minute warm-up is a reasonable target for a thick block, with the heat increased in stages rather than jumping straight to maximum. This is not a shortcut. It is the price of using the tool safely. Once the block is hot, thinner pieces of beef work best. A steak around an inch thick or less is much more appropriate than a massive 2-inch cut. The salt surface makes direct contact with the meat. Moisture from the steak interacts with the salt, and the surface seasons as it cooks. The result can be remarkably even, but do not expect the salt block to perform miracles. It will season the outside, it will give you heat, it will not repair badly chosen meat, and it will not turn an overcooked steak into a good one. That distinction is important because there is a temptation with every cooking trick to believe the tool is more powerful than the cook. It isn't. The block is just another way of controlling heat and seasoning. Now let's go in the opposite direction. Instead of adding salt from a block, we can use fat as a barrier. This is an old idea that has been dressed up in expensive restaurants. Fat protects meat from air. That principle has been used for generations in kitchens where refrigeration was limited. At home, though, I would not recommend trying to recreate an elaborate long-term aging process in an ordinary refrigerator. That is where online advice gets dangerous. A home refrigerator is not a professional dry aging room. Humidity, airflow, temperature stability, sanitation, and cross-contamination all matter. You cannot simply put meat in the back of the fridge and declare it restaurant aged. If you want to experiment with aging, start with the whole piece rather than individual steaks, and understand that food safety is part of the process, but there is a simpler lesson here. Buy larger pieces when the price per pound makes sense. A whole strip loin or boneless ribeye can cost less per pound than buying the same beef already portioned into individual steaks. You do the cutting yourself. That is another place where the butcher's counter can save you money. The more processing someone else has already done, the more you are likely paying for it. And this is why I always tell people to learn the knife, not because everyone needs to become a professional butcher, because a knife gives you control over the piece of meat you bought. You can remove a thick section of connective tissue. You can divide a large roast into steaks. You can separate a lean section from a fatty section. You can change the thickness. You can cut across the grain. Those decisions can matter more than the difference between two grades of beef. Now let me give you one of the most useful tricks for a cheap steak that has very little fat. Build a crust, then baste. Start with a hot pan. Use a small amount of high-heat cooking fat. Once the steak has developed a strong brown surface, lower the heat slightly. Add a tablespoon or two of beef fat. If you want, add a smashed garlic clove and a sprig of rosemary or thyme. Tilt the pan and spoon the hot fat over the steak repeatedly for 30 to 60 seconds. You are not trying to cook the center with the butter or fat. You are building flavor on the exterior. This is where the inexpensive steak begins to feel more luxurious. The crust carries roasted flavors. The beef fat reinforces the beef flavor. The herbs add aroma. And the center remains controlled. But remember what this technique cannot do. It cannot create marbling. It cannot remove connective tissue. It cannot rescue a steak that has already been cooked 20 degrees too far. Basting is a finishing tool, not a rescue mission. That is a distinction professional kitchens learn very quickly. Now, if the cut is too tough for a normal steak treatment, stop pretending it is a steak. That may be the most valuable advice in this entire video. There are cuts that become excellent when cooked quickly. There are cuts that become excellent when cooked slowly. And there are cuts that become excellent when sliced thin. You have to choose the right battle. Take chuck. People hear chuck and immediately think pot roast. But chuck contains several different muscles and sections, and some are more useful for quick cooking than others. A chuck eye, when you can find one, can be a great value because it comes from the same general area as the rib section and can carry more beef flavor than its price suggests. But it is not identical to a ribeye. That is exactly why you need to treat it honestly. If you find a thick chuck eye, season it properly, build a crust, and control the center temperature, you can get a very satisfying steak without paying ribeye money. If the piece is full of connective tissue, however, slow cooking may be the better answer. A butcher sees that difference immediately. A shopper sees the word beef. That is why learning the anatomy of the animal is such a powerful money-saving skill. You are not just buying beef, you are buying a muscle. And every muscle has a history. Some muscles moved all day, some barely moved. Some contain more fat, some contain more connective tissue, some have grain running in one obvious direction. Others change direction halfway through. Your cooking method should follow that information. There is another restaurant trick that sounds extravagant but is surprisingly cheap: marrow butter. Ask your butcher for marrow bones. They are often inexpensive. Roast them at around 450 degrees Fahrenheit until the marrow becomes soft enough to spoon out. Mix the marrow with softened butter, salt, and herbs. Roll it into a log and chill it. Now you have a compound butter with a deep beef flavor. Put a small coin of it on a hot steak. Watch what happens. The butter melts. The marrow melts into it. The fat spreads across the crust. Suddenly the steak has richness that was never inside the original muscle. Again, this does not change the cut. It changes the finished bite. And that is what many expensive restaurant techniques are really doing. They are adding something the original ingredient lacks. A lean piece gets fat. A tough piece gets mechanical tenderization through slicing. A bland piece gets concentrated flavor. A cold plate gets replaced with something hot enough to hold the temperature. The technique is solving a specific weakness. Once you understand that, you stop copying recipes blindly. You start diagnosing meat, and that is a much more useful skill. Now let's talk about one of the most underrated pieces of equipment in the kitchen, the hot plate. Not a fancy serving platter, a hot piece of cast iron. Cook a thick steak perfectly, put it on a cold ceramic plate, and the steak immediately starts giving its heat away. The first bite is hot, the last bite is cooler. That is especially noticeable with large steaks. If you preheat a cast iron pan or heavy serving surface and use it carefully as a resting or serving surface, the steak stays warmer longer. You do not need to spend money on a restaurant-style stone. You already have the equipment. A cast iron pan can do the job, but there is one rule. Do not keep cooking the steak aggressively after it reaches the temperature you want. The hot surface can continue pushing heat into the meat. Use it as a holder, not a second grill. Now we come back to the knife. This is the step I would teach before almost anything else. Find the grain, then cross it, and watch the direction carefully. On some cuts, the fibers do not run perfectly straight from one end to the other. You may need to rotate the meat halfway through slicing. That is especially important with cuts like sirloin and some larger muscles that change direction. If you cut half the steak correctly and the other half with the grain, you have created two different eating experiences on the same plate. That is why I never judge a steak only by how it looks when it comes out of the pan. Cutting is part of cooking. Serving temperature is part of cooking. Resting is part of cooking. Even the thickness of the slices is part of cooking. A thick slice gives the teeth more work. A thinner slice can make a stronger muscle much easier to eat. This is how you get more from the meat you already paid for. And there is one final trick that costs almost nothing. Rest the steak. Not for an hour, not until it is cold. Just long enough for the heat to settle and the juices to stop rushing around when you cut into it. For a typical thick steak, 5 to 10 minutes is often enough. Use that time to finish the sauce, heat the serving plate, or slice your sides. Then cut across the grain and pay attention to the result. If the steak is still tougher than you wanted, do not automatically blame the meat. Ask what happened. Was the cut appropriate for fast cooking? Was it sliced correctly? Did you cook it too far? Was it wet when it hit the pan? Did you crowd the pan? Did you rush the crust? Did you skip the resting period? Did you use an enzyme marinade too long? Every one of those mistakes can make good beef seem bad, and every one of them is cheaper to fix than buying a more expensive steak. That is the real lesson. You are not going to turn a $9 steak into a genetically different piece of beef. That is not how cooking works. But you can take a modest cut and get dramatically more out of it. You can dry it, salt it properly, choose the right heat, build the crust, control the center, add fat where the meat needs richness, slice across the grain, and choose a cooking method that matches the muscle. Do those things consistently and the price on the package becomes much less important. The next time you are standing in front of a meat case, do not start by looking at the biggest price tag. Look at the muscle, look at the thickness, look at the grain, look at the fat. Then ask yourself what that particular piece needs. That is how a butcher shops. And that is how you stop paying premium prices for techniques you can perform in your own kitchen. If you try one of these methods this week, tell me what cut you started with, what you paid for it, and how you cooked it. The interesting part is not whether you bought the cheapest steak in the store. It is whether you learned how to make that steak work for you. Because there is another piece of beef I would look at before I ever reached for a premium ribeye. It sits close to the rib section, comes from the same general muscle family, and shoppers routinely walk past it because the label makes it sound ordinary. but there is a specific place where the value changes dramatically. Move your knife a few inches, and you can go from a cut people ignore to meat that sells for several times as much. That line is where the butcher makes money. And once you know exactly where it is, you may never look at the meat case the same way again.